I was quite struck by your discussion of uh, democratic and aristocratic excess, and the theme of democracy as developing in tandem with nationhood, and nationhood providing a basis under which democracy is woven together and underwritten, but at the same time also posing a problem for democracy. And I felt that to be distinct from the typical story that we're told about the crisis of liberal democracy in contemporary times as being threatened by nationalism and nationhood. So, could you unpack how your interpretation of that parts with the sort of conventional story we're told about liberal democracies, other threats to liberal democracy today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this really goes back to my initial preoccupations in 2016 with the way in which Brexit was being understood in particular, and the whole discourse of populism around it. I know it wasn't the only thing that was being labelled populist in 2016, but I was sitting in Britain in that year, and it seemed to me just sort of almost like self-evident that any idea that nationalism and nationhood were, if you like, alien interventions into democracy, that democracy was somehow being compromised by this burst of nationalism as it was understood, was just a fairly ahistorical way of thinking about how representative democracy came about in the first place, and the ways in which representative democracies had developed. And I would go beyond that and say, actually, the way in which, from some point in the 19th century or late 18th, 19th century, that nationhood became the predominant means by which all claims to political authority and all forms of, or almost all anyway, were legitimated. It isn't just a question, like of democracies needing nationhood. At a certain point, modern states, whatever the form of government, laid claim to authority and the right to exercise power in some sense by claiming, whether reasonably or disingenuously or just completely incoherently, to be the representative of a nation. And if you looked at the way in which this played out for countries or peoples, I should say, rejecting imperial rule,
Mm.
rejecting the rule of European empires, they claimed independence in the name of a nation. That seemed to me to be not something that one had to think about very hard to see that it was true, because it was still the world in which I, came to some kind of like political consciousness, being born in the late 1960s. So the whole way in which the nationalism as a problem for democracy debate was framed from the latter part of the 2010s just seemed to me to be like really just odd, and could in some sense, I think, only be explained by the way in which political analysis, particularly in the West, I would say, had just become detached from historical understanding at some point. I would argue from the 90s. In some sense, I think it was a function of the whole end of history plus globalization
Mm.
narratives. So I, had thoughts about this going back a long time, indeed, to the book that I spent quite a lot of time writing in the late 90s and early first part of the um, 2000s. So, in a sense, I wasn't really I wasn't engaging with new thinking for me in making some of the arguments in the democracy part of the book. What I think I did that was different was that I was more interested than I had been in the past in the question of the particular ways in which these languages of nationhood also acted as their own destabilizing force within democratic politics. So, what happened to the language of nationhood when you really have significant migration into democracies? And particularly what happens when they're long standing democracies and the language of nationhood has taken shape in a long time in the past. And then that historical story that's told about it has much less resonance to the citizens who are presently living there.